Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive, where we like to, dive deep into some of the most crucial social issues facing India.
Exactly.
Issues that really matter.
Yeah.
And that we need to get beyond those, those surface-level headlines.
Yeah, absolutely.
And today, we're going to be focusing on something that's incredibly relevant, particularly since March 31st just passed.
Right.
Which was the International Transgender Day of Visibility. And it got us thinking, we really need to dive deep into the realities for transgender individuals here in India.
A topic that's, constantly in the news.
Constantly.
And, it's important to look beyond just the day itself and really understand.
Absolutely.
What are the challenges that are faced by this community?
Yeah, so we have a fantastic source today, an article from The Hindu, and it really does a great job of laying out the complexities.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful piece.
Yeah, and, it really kind of hit us when we were reading it that, there's this tension between legal recognition and the actual lived experiences.
Right. On the ground, and how those two don't always match up.
Absolutely. And I think, for our listeners out there who are, really following current affairs closely, particularly if you're looking at the UPSC exams, this is such a crucial area. Right?
Oh, absolutely. This is hitting on social justice.
Yes.
Policy implementation, inclusive development. I mean, this is core stuff.
Absolutely core stuff. And I think, The Hindu really brings this to the forefront by talking about the Transgender Persons Act.
Right.
The Protection of Rights Act of 2019.
Right, 2019.
So that's, on paper, sounds like a big step forward.
Huge step.
Right? Offering legal recognition safeguards.
Yeah.
But then the article goes on to talk about how there's this gap between what the law aims to do and what's actually happening.
It's the implementation.
Yes.
Right. And this is where, the rubber meets the road, so to speak.
Right. And, one of the first things that the Hindu points out is this hurdle of getting identity documents.
Yeah. Which sounds, on the surface, it's like, okay, you need an ID, but it's so fundamental.
It's everything.
Because without that, you can't access other entitlements, other services. It's
trickle down to everything.
Absolutely. And, they have some really stark data in there.
Give us the numbers.
Yeah. So by December of 2023, the National Portal for Transgender Persons had received over 24,000 applications for identity certificates.
Okay.
But only about 15,800 had been issued.
Oh, wow. So there's a significant gap there.
Huge gap.
Yeah.
And people are just waiting.
In limbo.
Yeah, and then they talk about the situation in Delhi, which is even more striking.
Delhi's always an interesting case study, right?
It is. And so they say that by 2022, only 23 identity cards had been issued.
23?
23.
Wow.
In a city where the estimated transgender population is over 4,000.
I mean, that's a tiny...
It's minuscule. It's minuscule. And it really, kind of highlights this bottleneck that's happening, right? And, I think for our listeners, it's interesting to think about why that is right.
Why is that happening?
Is it a lack of training amongst officials? Are the documents required difficult to obtain?
Yeah, is it, a matter of resources?
Exactly.
Right? And then the Hindu shifts gears a little bit and starts talking about economic exclusion.
Right, which is another huge piece of this.
Huge. And it really makes the point that economic empowerment is key.
Yes.
For broader social inclusion. It's like you can't have one without the other.
Absolutely. And, I think one of the things that really struck me was they cite a 2018 report from the NHRC.
Yep.
And that report said that 92% of transgender individuals were excluded from formal employment.
92%. I mean, that is...
Just a staggering number.
That's almost everybody.
Almost everybody. And think about what that means. It means they're pushed into informal sectors.
Right.
Which are often precarious, sometimes dangerous.
Absolutely.
And things like sex work are often, the only option for survival.
Right. And that perpetuates the cycle. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then there's another even more recent study they cite from 2022.
Yeah.
That found a 48% unemployment rate among transgender individuals.
Which is so much higher than the national average.
Huge. Yeah, the national average is, what, 7-8%?
Yeah, something like that.
So, I mean, this is a major issue. And I think for those of you preparing for your exams, think about how this connects, right?
Right.
So to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
If you're economically vulnerable, how does that impact your ability to housing, healthcare, education?
Absolutely.
But it's all connected.
It's all connected. And the Hindu also talks about workplace discrimination.
Yeah.
Which is, a major factor contributing to those high unemployment rates.
And it's not just, not getting hired. Right?
And it's not just that it starts right from the hiring process with, inherent biases.
So not even being considered.
Not even considered. And then even if you manage to get a job, there's hostile work environments, lack of basic facilities like gender-neutral restrooms.
Right. Yeah, those basic necessities that we often take for granted.
Absolutely. And, I thought it was interesting that the Hindu mentions some companies that are doing good work.
Like who?
Like Tata Steel. They're actively working towards inclusive hiring practices.
Okay, so there are some bright spots out there.
There are, and it shows that change is possible.
Possible, but...
But as they point out, these are still very much the exception, not the norm.
Right. And we also have to think about, financial inclusion.
Yeah.
Even with things like, joint bank accounts now being allowed for LGBTQ plus individuals, there are still so many barriers.
Underlying societal biases and just lack of understanding within financial institutions.
Yeah, and it's hard to, it's hard to break down those barriers.
It is. It's a long-term process.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on. The Hindu also spends a good chunk of time talking about education and awareness.
Right.
And really emphasizing that education is so key.
Yes.
For long-term social mobility. It's like that's the pathway.
Absolutely.
But it seems like the reality for a lot of transgender students is just filled with obstacles.
It is. They talk about bullying, harassment, lack of support from institutions, and it's really disheartening to read.
It's tough. And they bring up that 2011 census data, which shows that the literacy rate among transgender individuals was 56.1%.
Much lower than the national average.
Significantly, yeah.
Which was around 74% at that time.
Right. So that right there tells you something.
It does. It shows that there are systemic disadvantages.
Absolutely. And then they share this statistic from Kerala.
Yeah.
Where 58% of transgender students reported dropping out of school.
Wow.
Due to discrimination.
That's heartbreaking.
That's a lot of potential.
Lost potential.
Yeah, and there were some states that are doing some good things.
Right. They talk about reserved seats in educational institutions and dedicated hostels, which is fantastic.
It's a start, but...
It's a start, but the problem is there's no consistent national policy.
Right, so it's very uneven.
Very uneven, and, it makes you think, how can we ensure that everybody has that access?
Regardless of where they live.
Exactly. And the Hindu really emphasizes the need for gender-sensitive curricula.
Yes.
Inclusive campus environments, financial assistance, vocational training. I mean, it's a whole package.
It's not just one thing.
It's not just one thing. It's a whole system.
Yeah, and then they move on to healthcare.
Another crucial aspect.
Oh, my gosh. And it's like another area where it just seems like barrier after barrier.
Barrier after barrier. And they talk about things like denial of treatment, lack of competent providers.
Yeah, and the cost. The cost is huge.
And it's so fundamental, right?
It is.
Like, healthcare is something everybody needs.
Absolutely. And, they cite this survey from the National Legal Services Authority that found that 27% of transgender individuals were refused healthcare.
Just because they were transgender.
Based on their identity. And that's just,
unacceptable.
It's unacceptable.
Yeah, and then there's the Ayushman Bharat TG Plus card.
Which, in theory is a good thing. It offers coverage up to 5 lakh rupees.
Right, which sounds like a lot. But as the Hindu points out, implementation has been patchy.
Inconsistent.
Inconsistent across different regions.
Right, and when you think about gender-affirming surgeries, which can cost, anywhere from 2 to 5 lakh rupees.
That's a significant amount.
That's a lot of money.
And, there's also a shortage of trained professionals.
Yeah.
Limited mental health services. And that's a crucial aspect, too.
Absolute mental health is so important.
So important and, often overlooked.
Yeah. And so what does the Hindu suggest? They must have some solutions.
They do. They suggest mandating transgender health training for medical professionals.
Okay, so starting right at the education level.
Right at the education level, and then expanding insurance coverage to fully cover gender-affirming procedures.
Okay, so making it accessible.
Accessible, and then finally establishing dedicated clinics.
Clinics that are, specifically for...
equipped to provide sensitive care.
Yeah, and really, thinking about the whole person.
Holistic care.
Yes.
And then they make this really important point that legal and economic reforms are essential.
Of course.
But they're not enough.
They're not enough.
You need societal transformation as well.
Right, because you can have all the laws in the world, but if people's attitudes don't change.
Exactly. And they talk about the harmful stereotypes in media representation.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It's a huge one. And they mentioned this positive initiative, the I Am Also Human campaign by the Humsafar Trust.
Okay, so there are people trying to change the narrative.
There are. And then they also talk about cultural events like Tamil Nadu's Kuvagam Festival, which provide visibility.
Okay, so that's good, right? Visibility is important.
It's a first step. But as the Hindu stresses, we need more than just events.
Right. We need systemic change.
Systemic change that tackles prejudice and discrimination.
Yeah, and it's so ingrained sometimes, right?
It is. It's deeply
It's hard to untangle.
And, it's in families, it's in workplaces, it's in education.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. So looking ahead, I think, the Hindu makes it clear that real change requires a lot of effort.
Yeah, it's not going to happen overnight.
Not at all. It requires sustained effort, collaboration.
And it has to be intersectional.
Right. It has to involve everybody.
It's not just one group.
Government, civil society, organizations, the private sector, everyone has a role to play.
Right. And it has to be, a coordinated approach.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the specifics that they highlight? Because I know they get into some really concrete recommendations.
Yeah, they talk about the need for effective implementation of laws like the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act.
Right. So it's not enough to just have the law on the books.
It has to be enforced.
You have to put it into practice.
And there has to be accountability.
Right. Who's making sure this is actually happening?
Exactly. And they also talk about the importance of government funding for welfare schemes.
Yeah, making sure that funding is adequate.
Adequate and transparent.
So we know where it's going.
We know where it's going and that it's actually having an impact.
Right. Are these programs actually working?
Exactly.
And then in education, they call for those national level policy reforms.
Yes.
To make sure that the curricula are inclusive, that there are support systems in place.
So that students don't drop out.
Right. Because we saw those numbers.
We did, and it's a huge loss.
And when it comes to healthcare, they reiterate that need to integrate transgender healthcare into medical training.
Right. From the start.
From the get-go, and expand that Ayushman Bharat TG Plus scheme.
Make it more accessible.
So more people can benefit
from it. And they also talk about establishing those specialized clinics.
Right, and staffing them with people who are trained.
Trained in trauma-informed care.
Yeah, that was a really important point.
Because, we have to acknowledge the history of discrimination.
Right, and the trauma that comes with that.
Absolutely.
And then they also highlight the role of public-private partnerships.
Which is, a really interesting avenue.
In economic inclusion.
Creating safe workplaces, skills training, financial support for transgender-led businesses.
So it's not just the government's responsibility.
It's a collective effort.
It's everybody coming together.
Absolutely. And finally, they put the onus on the media and the entertainment industry as well.
To do their part.
To promote nuanced and authentic portrayals.
Right.
To challenge those stereotypes.
Because media is so powerful, right?
It is.
It shapes how we see the world.
It shapes our perceptions.
Yeah. And then they give a shout out to civil society organizations as well.
Right.
For their work in community building, legal literacy advocacy.
They're on the ground doing the work.
They're the ones, really pushing for change.
Day in and day out.
So the big takeaway here from the Hindu is that true inclusion, it requires more than just words.
Absolutely.
It's about action.
It's about enforcing anti-discrimination laws, inclusive hiring practices, financial empowerment.
It's about moving beyond just acknowledging that transgender people exist.
Right.
To actually empowering them.
And integrating them into society.
Yeah, and I think that's where I want to turn to our listeners, especially those of you who are preparing for the UPSC exams.
Right.
Think about this. What's our responsibility?
Both individually and collectively.
In making sure that these legal rights
translate into real change.
In people's lives.
In everyday life.
What can we each do in our own spheres of influence to create a society where everyone is truly included and has the opportunity to thrive?
And for those of you who are gearing up for the UPSC exams, this deep dive into the challenges faced by transgender individuals in India really gets at the heart of the social justice syllabus.
Absolutely. It's highlighting those gaps in policy implementation, the importance of inclusive development. This is all crucial stuff for your mains.
Absolutely.
And potentially even prelims.
Right. Understanding these ground realities and the complexities of, bridging that gap between legal frameworks and what's actually happening on the ground.
That's what it's all about.
That's what it's all about.
So we hope that this deep dive, based on this fantastic article from The Hindu, is giving you all a lot to think about.
A lot to chew on.
And if you found it informative and you want to keep the conversation going, please hit that like button.
Subscribe to our channel.
Leave a comment, let us know your thoughts. We're always eager to hear from you. And once again, our source for today's deep dive was The Hindu.
Thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
For this vital discussion.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.